name is Bob Dinerstein. I'm president of the board of the Equal Rights Center and professor of law and acting dean at American University, Washington College of Law.
The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 30 years ago and was intended as a national mandate for the elimination of discrimination against individuals with disabilities. When have you seen the ADA succeed?
Well, the ADA has succeeded, I think, in a number of areas of life that people with disabilities experience. Transportation is far more accessible today than it was 30 years ago. We have buildings and other institutions of society are much more accessible than they were 30 years ago. And we have a number of areas of society that essentially were unavailable to people with disabilities that are now available to them, as is in fact, of course, should be the case. The ADA has served an important symbol for the rights of people with disabilities that 30 years ago, many people would not know that people with disabilities were people with rights. They would, if they thought of them at all, they would think of them as people who deserved our pity, who were people who were needy, who were vulnerable. What we've seen over the last 30 years is a sense of people with disabilities as empowered, as people who can make contributions to society, and whose limitations are much less the result of any impairment they might have, and rather the result of society's interaction with them and its failure to accommodate to them. So we have a greater, one might say, a consciousness of the contributions of people with disabilities over time. We also, 30 years ago, had much more segregation of people with disabilities in institutions. Institutions for people with intellectual disability, institutions for people with psychosocial disabilities, use of nursing homes, etc. We still have these institutions, but they are many fewer and they are smaller than they were. And so much of our history about dealing with people with disabilities has included segregation, unnecessary segregation. This is a really critical change that has resulted. I would also lastly say, as an important element of the ADA, the symbolism of it has been important domestically, but also internationally. The ADA was very critical in inspiring some of the important elements of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. 181 countries have ratified that convention to date. Sadly, not the United States, but the United States. But the ADA was very important to the drafters of the convention. And in addition, a number of countries around the world have patterned their disability rights legislation after the ADA. So a lot of society has opened up as a result of the ADA, and really as a result of the advocacy of people with disabilities, their allies, government agencies that have worked with them.
Where do you see opportunities for the ADA to be applied more impactfully going forward?
Well, here I would say we have a number of areas. Maybe the most important one is applying the ADA directly to the digital world, and particularly the internet. When the ADA was enacted 30 years ago, the internet was not in general use. It was still being developed and rolled out by the Department of Defense. As a consequence, Title III of the ADA does not explicitly refer to access to the internet as the kind of access that is covered by that title. A second area of growth, I would say, would be with respect to the intersection of the criminal justice system and people with disabilities. As you know, we've been dealing most recently with the latest rash of dangerous and violent interactions between police and people of color, George Floyd and others. And many of the people who have been involved in these incidents over the last 8-10 years and going back even further, not only have been people of color, but also have been people with disabilities. The COVID crisis, of course, has raised a number of questions for the entire society, particularly for people with disabilities, people of color, other people who are economically marginalized. And one of the things that has shown us is that we need to think through carefully about protocols for providing treatment to people with disabilities. We want to make sure that COVID-19 protocols for rationing what might be limited medical protective devices, for example, or such as ventilators are not rationalized in some way that disadvantages people with disabilities. As I think I mentioned earlier, ADA was an important influence on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and as I also mentioned, the United States has not ratified the CRPD, as it's called. One of the arguments that some opponents made to ratification is, well, we don't need the CRPD, we have the ADA. I think I would say the ADA goes very far, but the CRPD covers some areas that the ADA does not. And it is rather embarrassing for the United States, given its leadership in the leadership role with regard to disability rights, to not be a country that has ratified that document. So the hope would be in another administration, I would say that in fact ratification could still occur. So those are some of the areas where I think we could be looking over in the next period of time. Some additional areas where the ADA could be a positive force for the full integration of people with disabilities, for the effectuation of the very important motto of the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us, making sure that people with disabilities are seen, heard, and otherwise integrated into society as fully as they wish to be. Thank you very much.